So I'm joined today by Pete Dougherty, Chairman of the IMLPO, and I guess in that vein I'll open with that. What is the IMLPO?
So the IMLPO has been going for 25 years now. It is very similar to the AMLP forum in that it is a forum for money laundering reporting officers, deputies and people in the financial crime system who want to hear about relevant things to their job on a day-to-day basis. Where I think we're different to the AMLP forum, which I say is a brilliant forum and I've worked with Adriana for years, is that we're slightly more niche. We tend to cater to smaller institutions. And we tend to be more focused on practical day-to-day to-do things for people in the financial crime world or anti-financial crime world.
Mm-hmm. So to join, do I need to be senior in financial crime or?
No, I mean, obviously we have a mentoring system for up-and-coming MLROs or for MLROs who are new to the role and are trying to navigate their way through the political landscape that unfortunately we'll enter. But you can be a junior member. It really depends on your organisation, firstly, whether they're going to pay for the membership. But if you want to join independently, you don't have to be a certain level to join.
Okay. And so let's start from the bottom and we'll start working our way up. Imagine you're restarting your career tomorrow in financial crime. What would you recommend people focus on? I mean, there's so many niches within that world. Do you want to be a generalist? Does it matter what you do?
I think in financial crime, you always start off as a generalist. Mm-hmm. Well, I say that, you did always start off as a generalist. Mm-hmm. As that world has grown and the cottage industry has become a massive industry, mm-hmm. There are distinct disciplines now. There are sanctions, there is transaction monitoring, there is quality assurance and quality control. Those areas are now quite niche, and once you get in it, mm-hmm. you tend to be focused on those. If you want or aspire to be an MLRO, you're going to have to learn all of those different elements. Mm-hmm. If you don't, then when you are an MLRO, it's a big learning curve to then manage those elements. Again, you could be in a very small institution, in which case you've got hands-on in all of it, or you could be in a massive institution where actually your quality control or your QC team or your sanctions team is quite independent from the MLRO. Yeah. Whilst they may have some kind of dotted line in the bigger organisations, it's a group head of fin crime, and the MLROs will be local MLROs. Yeah. So it really depends on what organisation you're in, but if you want to be an MLRO, you need to understand all of those areas. Yeah.
So if I'm looking to build a career, let's say, I mean, you mentioned some of the bits, right? I get offered a one-year contract in sanctions, in policy, in EDD, in transaction monitoring, whatever it might be. Having done a year doing that specific job, I should go and do more time and become an expert in that, or I should try and move to one of the other areas?
I think it depends on how much you liked that year. If you loved that year and that's what you think is your future, there is a career to be a head of sanctions, to be a group head of sanctions, to be a regional head. And that will be a very rewarding career if that's what you enjoy. Again, if you want to be an MLRO, then you want to then try and do something that is another arm to the AML or the anti-crime framework. And there's plenty of ways to do that. You want to understand not just the second line area, you want to understand the first line area as well, because if you don't understand the first line, who you are giving advice to, then you're not going to be much use as an MLRO. Product-wise, you can learn, but I would suggest that if you want to go into the top role, and we call it the top role, let's come back to that maybe, then you want to go across all the areas. If you really enjoy what you've gone in and done a contract in, then there's nothing wrong in specialising in that. But if you do take the route of learning more areas, make sure you keep up to date with the area that you've just left behind. Because you will still need it.
How easy is that path into other areas? So imagine someone joins one of your teams. I mean, you've been the MLRO for a number of big name institutions and a number of smaller institutions, not in terms of grandiose, in terms of headcount and sizing and products and business lines, etc. I send you a CV, whatever, you've got an ABC job. I send you a CV of someone that's got 3 years transaction monitoring experience. There's not really a relevant skill that's going to make it appropriate for you to bring them in over someone that does the doing, if that makes sense. But is there a path? Can I learn other stuff? Could I teach myself? Could I come to the IMLPO and someone teaches me something new or guides me somehow?
So the answer is yes to all of that. You can go off and do courses, which there are plenty of now, ACAMS, ICA, and there are other areas that will do courses. There's mentoring, as we say, through IMLPO. But if you go through to some of the if you sign up with a lot of the law firms, they will send you briefings on ABC or on fraud or on sanctions, whatever it might be. What I would suggest is that, or what I would do if I saw someone who had been in sanctions for a year and they wanted an ABC role, it would be very much about talking to them at the interview. I will never rule someone out. If they're in the financial crime world, then there's a good chance they can transition into a different area. It again depends on seniority. So if you've been your whole career in sanctions and you've done 25 years and you suddenly want to do ABC, I'm not saying you can't, but it's going to be harder for someone to think, why does he want to start halfway down the ladder again in ABC? Because you're not going to go straight into a top role unless you're in an organisation, when then the senior management may say, well, he's a great manager in sanctions, we can bring him across to
give them an opportunity
to ABC. So it's very dependent on you as the individual, how you present yourself at the interview, and that the hiring manager has worked with the right people to bring in the right CVs. What you don't want is, and I've experienced it on the reverse end, is where you're applying through a box with an algorithm where you don't meet the supposed requirements, and therefore you don't even get to the interview stage or for the hiring manager to see your CV.
Okay. Just going to go back a bit. You mentioned that first line or second line experience both being useful, both being valid. From my side, 20 years recruitment, it's relatively easy to get an opportunity for your first job, first line, KYC, onboarding, anything, the paper-based end initially. I say the paper-based end because obviously as you grow and develop, you get exposure to high-risk clients, you start making decisions on things, the role changes there. We see it less frequently that people get their first opportunity in the second line, but the biggest thing I see from recruitment angle is how hard it is for people with first-line experience to move to get second-line jobs. Is there a way that you can guide people to make that easier? What would you recommend?
So I actually think it's as hard to go from second line to first line. There's this barrier. It's the same barrier that you have for different reasons, but it's the same barrier you have of an MLRO in an investment bank working in a retail bank or vice versa. There's this prejudice or predetermined thought process that you are stuck to one. And so you do have to make the effort to learn what the second line does, to understand the difference between the doing and the checking, and understand how important the checking is. And also understanding that you're not there to be the police force. You're there to guide and advise the first line, be that the first line fin crime teams or the first line business. Or ops who might be looking for a steer on how to build a system, the IT world, whatever it might be. You've got to look at what you're trying to achieve and where you're trying to get to, and then speak to the right people and pick on the areas that you want to focus on to do that. And then again, when you go to an interview, sell that knowledge as something you've learned in advance of getting the opportunity to perform it. But it is difficult, and there are those barriers there, and they're not even barriers that I think are meant intentionally. They're barriers, they're perceptional barriers. Someone in the first line doesn't want a policeman coming into their area. They want someone who's going to be thoughtful from the point of view of, we're here to bring in business. And there's still that barrier between the first and second line about the second line is there to prevent business, and the first line is there to bring it on. And in some places, and many people don't have that attitude, but they're still there. And it's the same barrier that you're going to face about transitioning either way.
You mentioned the police force a couple of times, and you mentioned crime in that guise. How easy is that transition? I guess after how do I move from first line to second line, the most frequently asked question we get that's second to that is, I've done 10, 12, 15 years in a police force regionally, locally, may have had financial crime exposure or some investigations exposure or something like that. How easy to make the transition? Can you get into the private sector nowadays?
I think it's difficult to make the transition. It's more difficult for the individual than it is in getting the job. Although I think the barriers have increased to police officers moving into the financial sector, in private sector. And the reasons for that are that there is experience that says a lot of police officers who move across are looking for an easy ride for more money.
Gotcha.
I don't believe that's true of 99%, but unfortunately there was some 30-year police officers who were quite senior, who came out, went into industry and did very little.
Right.
There were junior people who came out and thought it was easy street. You would earn 50, 60, 70 grand or more, which is obviously a vast improvement on their wages, but felt that they didn't have to put in the hours because the work they did before was harder. You will find when you come out that you work longer hours. When I first came out, I went to a company called Fidelity, and I lived in West London, and they were in Surrey, and I was getting there by 7 in the morning and leaving at 8 o'clock at night, driving around the M25. One, to prove that I was there to work, because the 2 people who'd gone in before me had been golfers from 2 in the afternoon and hadn't got in till 11 in the morning most days, which was the reason they were cleared out. And 2, because I wanted to learn. So that's the first barrier. The next barrier is, how do they show the skills they've got, which will all be useful on a CV. And in my experience, personal and seeing them come to me, police officers can't write CVs. So they need to go to someone who's got experience in putting a CV together and say, right, I've got these skills. How do I make that look like it's going to work in the private sector? And that's, it might be a freebie if you know someone, or it might be 150 quid well spent. It is 150 quid well spent. I luckily had someone who I wrote all my skills down on a bit of paper. And because I was on the fraud squad, it was a bit easier because I was dealing with financial crime. But someone took my skills and put it into a CV, and I read it and didn't recognise the person whose CV I was reading, which was lucky. I then had to learn that CV, which was all factual and correct, but I had to learn it for when I went to an interview. Because my mind wasn't used to that way of thinking.
Of course.
And then the third barrier is, when you get there, you can't be a police officer. You've got to realise you're now in the corporate world. Your skills are important, but you've got to learn where to stop. And the natural instinct of a police officer is not to stop until they get to the end. You no longer have that luxury or time, and the institution doesn't have that money to waste on that level. They've got to escalate it to the police afterwards.
Makes sense. It's interesting when you talk about the writing a CV in the right way, because I regularly say to people that the CV is the key to get in the door in the first place, right? And the interview is ultimately where everything happens. But that first barrier, I guess, is when you put your CV across and someone doesn't see the skill set that you potentially bring. So I get the premise on rewriting it. I just want to kind of bring together the bits and pieces we discussed. So let's imagine I'm either fresh grad a couple of years in, or forces trying to make the transition across. When you're reading CVs, which you must have done thousands of times having been at the level that you've been at, and someone's got an ACAMS qualification or one of the other bits and pieces, a CISI or whatever, is it the indication that they've gone out and spent their own money to do it in the first place that you spot and think this person's committed to a career? Or are you genuinely thinking there's a load of learning there that will have accelerated their career over other people that may have some exposure but in a limited space?
So for me, it's more the fact that they've made that effort. That they've gone somewhere. So if they had on their CV, took a mentorship at IMLPO, or have spoken to 20 different MLROs at these organisations to learn what it is they're looking for and what I need to do, I would find that as compelling as an ACAMS or an ICA certificate. Not that I decry those, I think they're great to have, and I will always encourage staff who work with me or for me to go out and get those qualifications, because it gives them a deeper understanding. And if they've done it in advance, it definitely shows they've got an interest, and especially if they've paid for themselves. Obviously, a lot of people will get it paid for through their organisations. They've still got to do the work while they're working, though. So it shows a level of commitment. But for me, it's as important, as I say, if they'd gone to 20 different MLROs and said, look, I've reached out to these people and tried to speak to them. That shows initiative in itself. It also shows guts, because a lot of those people won't give you the time of day. And I find that strange when they've had to do pretty much the same thing in the past. But a lot of MLROs out there will, or deputies, or senior fin crime professionals will give that time, because it's not that much time at the end of the day. And then, as I say, for me, it's how they react in interview. Do they show the aptitude? Because again, you can go and get a certificate, and some people are brilliant at studying and doing exams, but they're not good at putting that into practice or interpreting scenarios.
Of course. And do you think it changes as you go up the levels? People often ask us, should I go and do this qualification? And if people are out, I say what you've just said, i.e. it shows, if I've got 10 CVs, you've all got exactly the same experience, but you've paid for this and the other 9 haven't, it shows you're more committed than they are in my eyes. Once people are in and people regularly phone us and say, look, I'm looking for my next steps, do you think I should do a qualification? If I'm honest, I often say to people, well, if your business believes it's worthwhile, they'd pay for you to do it.
Yeah.
So if they're not offering to pay for it, do they believe it's worthwhile? But reflecting, that doesn't mean that you or someone else sat somewhere else doesn't see it as worthwhile. So is it still worth self-funding stuff as you're going through, or?
I think it depends on your circumstances.
Yeah.
But I think, yes, it's still worth self-funding for your own development. If you're really keen on something, you will try and learn in that area.
Yeah.
Whether you do it through paying, as I say, for a $3,500, $4,000, $5,000 course,
yeah.
and whether you're in a position to do that, because a lot of people aren't,
yeah.
Or whether you do it through some form of mentoring scheme or whatever, I think anything you do to boost your own knowledge on the subject that you say you're interested in is worthwhile.
Yeah.
You're right, most organisations, if they think it's worthwhile, will pay for it. However, most organisations won't put it on the table up front. They will wait for you to go to them.
Yeah.
So I would always say to people, have you tried that route?
Yeah.
The quid pro quo there is that should they do that and the organisation pays for it, they're usually then locked in for a period of time or have to pay it back themselves anyway.
Yeah.
So it depends again on whether they've got the funds that if they decide to leave because a job comes up, can they afford to then take it on themselves?
Yeah, yeah. Makes sense. You mentioned before the hurdles or the perceived hurdles of changing even at a senior level, whatever. I'm an investment banking MLRO, I can't get a retail broker or a buy-side firm or whatever. In your eyes, how easy is that transition?
I think the transition for the individual is quite easy. Mm-hmm. Again, depending on how much time they want to put in to learn that product.
Yeah.
Or do they understand what the fundamental differences between, say, investment banking and retail banking are? And I don't mean from the point of view of purely the products, but what are the concerns in a retail bank versus an investment bank? In a retail bank, you're going to look much more at fraud. Yeah. You're going to look much more at volume. Yeah. In an investment bank, it's going to be complexity. Yeah. And it's going to be less fraud, far more pure AML or bribery and corruption. Yeah. So not to say you don't get fraud or vice versa. So how clued up is the individual on the differences? Because if you just apply for a retail role from an investment bank role because it's the next step, size-wise maybe, and it's offering you 20, 30 grand more a year, plus all the extra benefits or whatever, but you haven't understood the fundamental problems that a retail bank faces, and you go and you start talking complexity and how difficult an investment bank is, they're just going to look at you and go, you've got no aptitude for retail. You might actually have it, but you've not thought about who you're trying to speak to. And the same goes the other way. Once you're in, retail banking products and investment banking products are not that difficult to learn. I would say there's definitely more complexity on the investment banking products. But it's still about the money flow. And it's still about you understanding that money flow. So providing you get to that and you have committed to learning those products, then I would say it's not difficult. I would say it's a bigger hurdle learning the products coming from retail to investment banking. But it's a bigger hurdle understanding the amount of volumes and time-sensitive pressures you will be under moving into a retail environment. From our angle, we're often told the retail job is harder because of the breadth and depth and variety of candidates, I'm thinking recruitment, sorry, breadth and depth of customer base that you've got, and therefore the exposure that you might have, the volume and transactions and everything else. There's huge amounts going on. I don't know whether I would agree with that completely. I think retail banking is not difficult to get your arms around and your thought process around. It's whether you can cope at the speed of travel. And obviously, as you know, I've worked in different places, not a retail bank as such, but when I worked at Western Union, which was Fexco at the time, because Western Union couldn't get into the UK. When I first went there, they weren't making many disclosures. When we looked at our systems and our controls, we ended up making $1,200 a month. Wow. Now, that volume of disclosures with a team of 20 people, and that was it, just 20, which sounds a lot, but that's doing all of your other AML stuff as well,
Yeah.
is hard to keep pace of. And when some of those transactions are dealing with, paying for nail bombs in Iraq over an overnight transfer, and you're going to work the 24-hour shift because you've got to be on call to deal with that, that's something you rarely get in investment banking.
Yeah.
Don't get me wrong, the M&A guys or whatever who are on the business side, they could be working 15, 16-hour days, 18-hour days doing an M&A acquisition, but it's a different sort of pressure that you're getting. And those pressures are probably more real life than they are in an investment bank. In an investment bank, I sort of see it more like insurance fraud. Everyone thinks that it's victimless.
Yeah.
Because in investment banking, you're quite far removed from the individual in the street, there doesn't always appear to be an identifiable victim. It's going to be a corporate or something like that.
Yeah.
So you're not dealing with what I would call the real coalface of probably money laundering or fraud.
Yeah. Yeah, okay. And you've mentioned products a lot, and I get on the retail side of things where if you're dealing with individual customers, you need to understand whether they're taking mortgages or loans or whatever it might be. But if we're talking investment banking and we're talking products, if I want to grow a career in that space, do I actually need to understand the differences on private side between M&A and corporate banking, corporate broking, or on the public side, if I'm doing commodities, I need to understand the difference between precious metals and...
You certainly need to understand the risks they bring. And you need to understand the sort of areas that they're coming from and the people that will be working in those sectors, the companies that will be working in those sectors, because then you're going to start stepping into the world of potentially sanctioned areas. Particularly if you're talking about precious metals and stones, etc. You're going to be talking about mining in areas that could well have sanctions against them or could well be being mined by countries that have sanctions against them. You could be talking about very high net worth individuals. One of the things you'd have to be careful with there as well with the investment banking side is if you've got a private bank attached to the investment bank and you are looking at bringing a new contract in or a new relationship on the investment banking side, have you got a relationship on the private banking side? Because you could have a situation where you are bribing people to give you their money, or you're doing something that could be perceived as that. Sorry, not that you're actually doing it. So you then, your ABC comes in, your sanctions come in, all wrapped up in one inquiry. Whereas quite often in the retail side, a fraud inquiry is going to be a fraud inquiry. Yes, there is the ancillary money laundering with the proceeds of the crime, but the fraud itself is going to be your primary investigation. It's unlikely that there's a bribery and corruption issue at the same time, or that there's a sanction issue at the same time. Can happen, but it's not as common as getting it all involved in an investment banking product.
Understood.
And yes, you definitely do need to sort of understand the differences between, and I would throw in asset management as well. Pension funds, etc. You've got to understand what risks they're at. If you don't, then you're not going to be able to deal with it when it comes to you.
Understood. Okay. And what about pretty much every job we get nowadays in the compliance space, in the risk space, in the operations space, but not necessarily financial crime? We get told if someone's got Python or other coding skills, they're instantly a step up the ladder from the rest of them. Is coding coming for financial crime?
I've certainly seen more people in the fin crime space in institutions that understand how to tune transaction monitoring systems. Whereas when I started, that was IT. Never the twain shall meet. You tell them what you want, they go off and do it. You might do the beauty parade for the vendors that come in, but all of the work that goes on will be done there. And then all the back office stuff that went on post implementing those things was done by someone with an IT background. I think of people like Alan Chapman, who worked on the banking side, and you and I both know Alan very well. He's been an MLRO, he's been a head of compliance, but he's also worked on the banking side, and he understood the AS400 system and could write queries and everything, which helped him immensely with his compliance fin crime work. So coding side of it, I don't actually see us getting to a point where an MLRO needs to be a coder or where a deputy MLRO does. Because they will hire the specialists who are doing it day in, day out for that, or the specialist firms. But if you can read it and understand it, it may be an advantage in years to come as we move further down this whole AI and electronic world.
Is AI coming for financial crime?
Yes, definitely. Same as machine learning,
Yeah.
AI will definitely come in. Do I think it's going to have exactly the same issues as machine learning and what have you? Yes, it is. Firstly, you're not going to be able to rely on it initially. You're going to have a lot of tests on it to see that it's not giving you all the wrong information or that it's corrupting the information in some way.
Yeah.
The last thing you want to be doing is going after customers for concerns when there's no concerns, because that's going to do the reputation of the bank no good. Secondly, it's not going to reduce headcount, the same as machine learning didn't, because once it does get good, it's going to give you so much more output than the machine learning did.
Yeah.
And so you're going to need the people to deal with that. Now, it may be with AI, it weeds it out better. So maybe you end up with an equilibrium of where you are with the systems that are in play now, such as NICE Actimize or IFS or Jade or whatever it might be. But I do think it's got to come, and it's got to be beneficial, or it will. I think it will be beneficial at the mass data assessment that we have. What I'm hoping is that AI will also help clean up data in organisations in some way, because the nirvana for most organisations that they never get to is clean, single source or golden source data.
Yeah, makes sense. I'm just trying to think about the other bits and pieces that matter on the journey, but when you're looking at CVs, do academics matter to you? Do you care?
No, and especially now.
Yeah.
I think, again, university students will tell you themselves, they get out, they've got a first in whatever it might be, but they're up against 20 other people who've got a first in exactly the same degree, but theirs is from a Russell group and someone else's isn't from a Russell group, or theirs is from a Russell group but someone else's is from Cambridge or Oxford. And so the differential then becomes the university rather than the degree or the person. And there are so many people now with degrees going out there that all these grad programs that the banks had, and I haven't worked on a permanent role within a bank for a while now, but all of these programs they had, I would say that they're getting tons of great people who, and any of them could do the job. So how they're differentiating between them now, I don't know. And I read daily that, there's university graduates out there who are earning, 12 grand a year in a factory or whatever, because they just can't get a job in their chosen field. So for me, I don't think the academics, I think it's not, again, it shows an aptitude, it shows a desire to learn. But there are some people who are career learners, but not doers. And there are some people who are career doers and don't progress because they then don't learn either. You've got to find that happy medium. I will not see someone with a degree on their CV and someone who hasn't but has 3 years experience and say, I've got to go for the grad. I might have been told that in the past, but I wouldn't agree with it. It would be based again on the interview and the aptitude.
So having a degree is not essential, but if you do have one, what you've done can be beneficial. I'm a geography from Southampton, so you're not interviewing me, but someone that's done law and had AML and conflict knowledge as part of the training could be helpful. Someone's done economics could be helpful.
I mean, it definitely could, and someone who's done criminology could be helpful. Someone who's done geography might be fantastic in sanctions because they might understand some of these places that are sanctioned that your average person like me has never even heard of or thought of visiting. I don't think it, again, I think the degree, if it's role specific, particularly law for law, then yes, obviously, medical for medical. Once you come into this world, I've seen compliance officers with degrees in marine biology. And trying to get my head around how that got them above someone else for a role, I didn't quite understand.
Learn about sleeping with the fishes.
I mean, it could be that. It could be hung under the bridge somewhere in London, from years ago. So for me, again, it's very much about the individual. And do I think they want to get involved and they're going to work? Or do I think they're going to sit there and lord it over other people because they've got this aptitude to study and feel that they are better than? And as I say, equally, I've seen the people who have come from a working background who think they're always better than those with the degrees because they roll their sleeves up and know what they're doing. My boss at UniCredit, which became UniCredit from HVB, was a guy called Gary Leader, and he was the global head of syndicated lending, and he'd been a barrow boy, and he'd grown up that way, and he'd become the global head. He was fantastic to work for. He knew regulation, legislation inside out. And if you told him something on the 1st of April 2020, and then you went back a year later and told him something different because things had changed, he'd challenge you and say, and give you the date that you told him that it should be X, and why was it now Y?
Yeah.
And and he was a great boss to work for because he challenged me, but in a nice way, if I changed anything.
Yeah.
But he was also open to listening to that change as well.
Yeah.
Because he'd come up, literally from the ground.
Through that route. You just used the phrase, and you used a phrase that makes me think about you. It might sound silly to say that, but I remember the first time we met. And part of why, the phrase that you just used is roll their sleeves up. And any time, and honestly, I reckon 8 out of 10 briefs I get from clients, I get told we want someone that rolls their sleeves up. And I reckon in the last 20 years, every time I've met you, your sleeves have been rolled up. and without speaking out of turn, your tattoos are always on display. And I remember the first time I met you years ago, and I say years ago, probably 20 years ago, when everyone was fully suited and booted, and even those that allegedly rolled their sleeves up were there in a full suit and a tie. And I remember meeting you, no tie on, open shirt, sleeves rolled up, etc. And the discussion we had was all about like the doing. Right? How do you prove to people you go above and beyond? When you're looking for people in your team, how do they prove to you that they're better than the others? So that's the question I want to push towards now. We've got our first job, we've signed up to get a mentor with the IMLPO, we've started learning some other courses, we want to progress. What are the actual attributes, and on a day-to-day basis, how do I prove to you as my leader, as my boss, that I'm better than others, or that I'm the one you should invest your time in?
Well, I suppose the sleeves rolled up thing, obviously it's a very common phrase that people use. For me, it means that you're willing to stay with your team and do the work that needs to be done.
Yeah.
You don't clock off at 7 o'clock when they're still there working. And that's what I expect from team members with me, albeit that they're earning less.
Yeah.
But I expect that I would send them home before I go home. If they've done a long day, I don't want me leaving before they're leaving. Yeah. Sometimes that will happen because of the nature of whatever it is that's being done. Yeah. Or because you've got plans or whatever it might be. But for me, sleeves rolled up just means having a good work ethic and not being afraid to do the photocopying, even if you're the deputy MLRO, or not being afraid, not feeling that you must have an office or you must have a PA if you're more senior. And I've been asked many times when I've gone into organisations, we need a strategic thinker. But, you get there and then they're saying, oh yeah, but you need to do the work. I said, well, you've asked me to be a strategic thinker. Yeah. I said, I can do both, but you're not going to get 100% on both because I can't focus on one and then completely on one and not do the other. And then they've asked me, or I've been asked, are you a roll your sleeves up, get your hands dirty person? And I've gone into an organisation and said, yeah, absolutely, I'm that person, I can do that. And it's a senior role. And they say, oh, you're not strategic enough. So sometimes the organisations who come out with these, they're just trotting out the trite things they think are right for the employees that they want to hire. Yeah. But actually, they haven't really thought about what they want to do. Yeah. If I look at the team I managed at State Street, again, it was very much about if they did the work and it came to me and I approved it and it was good, they got the credit. If they did the work and went round me and it was bad, they would get a rollicking for it. Yeah. Hopefully nothing more. Yeah, yeah. Because we all make mistakes, we all get things wrong. Yeah. And if they did the work and I accepted it and it was totally wrong, then that's me. Yeah. Because I've accepted it and so I've taken it away from them. Yeah. And then that's me saying, that's my fault. Yeah. But I need to know what all of them are doing without micromanaging. Yeah. I need to know, if my deputy's away, I need to know what he's working on. And I need to understand it to the level that I can deal with it. Yeah. Just because I may be the European head doesn't mean that I can step back and go, well, then my deputy was dealing with that. I've got no idea how you go on with it. Yeah. Because that's not going to be a good answer. Yeah. But the organisations will often expect that at one end, but then when you give them that answer, we'll say, well, why don't you know about it? Yeah, yeah, yeah. So for me, it's always about knowing what your team's doing, understanding what they do, so that if you find yourself on your own in the office, which even with big teams can happen, you know how to deal with the problem that arises. Yeah. You know who to speak to. You know, you're not left going, well, my PA's not in today, so I don't know who I'm supposed to go to for that. Yeah, yeah. You've got that information. And the same goes for those people working for me. I want them to know who in IT they need to go to, who in the compliance QA team they need to speak to, who at Global they need to speak to, and understand that they may be the only person there and they need to get it done. They may not be able to make a final decision because of their level at the time, but they can get it to the point where they can take it to someone else, explain it, and give that final decision, or get that final decision given.
That makes sense. And so in that, guise, one of the skills to someone at the junior level or heading through to the mid-levels is managing up, really.
Yes.
Their communication with you and how they communicate and how frequently.
Yeah, and knowing that sometimes there's going to be the same as you say to the business. You know, if I can get this business through the door safely, then I'll approve it.
Yeah.
But there may be some hard no's. And it may be the same with your team members who are suggesting something or doing something. Sometimes there will be a hard no. That might be a hard no because it's wrong, or it might be a hard no because it's not the right time to escalate that particular concern or that particular issue for change or whatever it might be. But that they still come and suggest that, and they know that when they get the no, it's not a criticism, it's a time-sensitive issue, or it's a realisation that that's just not the right thing, and that their experience hasn't quite got them to that yet.
Yeah, okay, yeah, makes sense. So let's continue the progression through the journey. I've done the junior, I've done the mid-level, I'm now in a senior role. Is being an SMF 17 worth the danger money?
Difficult question to answer. From a reward perspective, I think it was getting there at one point. I think now it's diminishing again.
Yeah.
If I look at a lot of the challenger banks or the fintechs, they want it on the cheap. And I appreciate they have different cost constraints to some of the bigger banks.
Yeah.
But they've got to understand what that person is signing up for. And you are signing up for the fact that you are the first port of call that the regulator will come to, and that the skilled person will look at to see if you are suitable for that role, to see if you're performing it correctly. And they won't necessarily agree with the way you're doing things. So obviously the documentation side that is always talked about within an institution, make sure you document all of your decisions. They can disagree with them, but at least you've got a rationale as to why you've done something. But you are signing up for potentially a career-ending role. If you get it wrong, and it's quite clear you've got it wrong, through no negligence, but just lack of awareness, or your wife was leaving you, the dog died, and your child was sick all over your suit that morning, whatever it might be, but you're not focused on it, you could find yourself in a career-ending situation where the FCA fine you, ban you from holding the position, and that won't just affect you at that role. That will make it harder for you to get a job at any role, at any level, because people will look at you and go, well, clearly you don't know what you're doing, because they won't necessarily see the bigger picture. Hopefully there will be enough people who know you that might know it was a bad error or a bad day or whatever, or they know the stress you've been going through, and so give you that chance to come back somewhere. But it's a difficult one. And I think that the reward people are giving for that is not necessarily commensurate with the risk. The other thing that I think is very difficult to hold the SMS or to deal with when you're an SMF 17 is the political aspect. Within organisations, there are political animals who are very good at being political. And most MLROs are there to prevent the firm getting used for money laundering, sanctions purposes, ABC, whatever it might be. And they're not that political. So whilst you're there thinking, well, I just want to make sure everything's safe, everything's done, the I's are dotted, the T's are crossed, someone else is pulling strings behind because they're manoeuvring people to go in certain places, or they want a certain deal to get through or whatever, and you become the fool guy or the fool lady or whatever it might be for that particular issue. And then it's very difficult to get your voice heard in the organisation.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. A lot of the stuff I watch, and you hear senior leaders talking, they reference that every 1, 2, 3, 4 years, you should feel imposter syndrome because you've got yourself up a level to a job that you're not quite yet comfortable in. But if you don't put yourself in it, you're never going to grow, you're never going to develop or whatever. Feels like from your response, SMF 17 is not the one in that guise, right? You need to be trained and ready and appropriately qualified and not try and rush through.
Absolutely. SMF 16, SMF 17, you cannot take those roles if you are not ready to take those roles. People will, because again, it's the age-old thing of, well, maybe they're in an organisation, the MLRO's left or the compliance officer's left, and the vacancy is there, and it's either them or someone new comes in above them, and they may not get on with them.
Yeah.
So you take it. And it's a big uptick, although it's never as big an uptick in pay if you stay in the same organisation as it is if you move, which is why a lot of people move.
Yeah.
But it's an uptick, and it's a level above. The problem you face when you do that is one of two, or several actually. But the first one is a lot of people see you as the role you were in. And so it's very hard to gain credibility as the higher level.
Yeah.
They still sort of look at you and treat you as the individual. Not that they dislike you or don't like what you say, but it's just you were this person. And so now you're at this level.
Yeah.
You've come to the table, but we don't quite get it. We're not quite seeing it. And the other is that if you go into it when you're not ready, you will be like a rabbit in the headlights, and you will struggle. And if you're struggling from day one, that just gets bigger because the events get bigger. And the longer you're in, the more people are coming to you with big decisions to make. And if you start making them on a basis of looking at it, I've got to make a decision, I'm going to go yes. That's when it can go horribly wrong.
Yeah.
But you're under pressure from senior management to make that decision. You've sat on it for ages. Maybe you're more air towards the no, but then the no is wrong as well.
Yeah.
Maybe the no stops a really good bit of business and you were just too nervous to sign off on it.
Yeah.
So either way, you can get caught.
So when you make that reference, really good bit of business, too nervous to sign off on it, should financial crime professionals get paid bonuses?
Yes, I don't see why not. I think, like everyone else in the organisation, although it's not, in many cases, not a tangible cost benefit, you may have saved the organisation a massive loss, both regulatory fine and potential reputational loss, etc., if you let the wrong deal through. And if you bring the right deal in, if you do the extra legwork to get a deal over the table that maybe someone was trying to block, or maybe previously no one had looked at properly, and it is genuinely a good piece of business and you clear everything, there's nothing there that's untoward, then you've helped the business bring that on, but you'll get no credit for that profit that might make the business. But you're part of that chain. Everyone's part of that chain. So when I hear people say that they're the loss department or they bring nothing to the table, you do bring a lot to the table. You bring safety for the deals. It's just not tangible like the guy in the front office.
No, it makes a lot of sense. I need to fact check this, so before I get a barrage of grief. I read the other day that the regulator's written to over 600 firms who have had 3 or more MLROs in the last 3 years. Why is everyone leaving the MLRO job?
Partly because of the reasons we've just said. I think some people are getting in there and realising it's just not for them, the pressure. And people do suffer with the pressure. I think I always used to think the traders who sat in an investment bank on the trading floor with 8 screens in front of them, I used to think they must want to jump off a bridge every night because that would just destroy me looking at that. But there's pressure in any role. And again, there's the political aspect within an organisation, there's the regulator breathing down your neck, and you've got to get out that if you've done everything as you should do, if you comply with the regulations, then the regulator will move on to the CEO or to the group head of FinCrime or the group MLRO. But that's still a lot of stress while you're going through it. I also think people are realising they're not getting paid enough for that role, and therefore that's part of it. And I think a lot of people are getting into it and don't realise what they've signed up for and don't understand the level of complexity they're suddenly dealing with, and it's suddenly all theirs to deal with. So aside from the pressure that can build, there's a lot of things that when you are a deputy MLRO, you're not making decisions on. You're not the final arbiter of what's going to be said or what's going to be done. And you're not the person that's in charge also of the sanctions team, the ABC team, the fraud team. You are the deputy MLRO. So suddenly when you've got all these other things to look at, and then you've got maybe a team of 10 people, 3 of whom are on maternity leave, 1 who's got mental well-being issues, which are all real things you need to account for, but you're not going to get backfill headcount, and you've still got to fill all those roles. And you've got to be, quite rightly, sympathetic stroke empathetic to your staff members, because they need to have those things dealt with. You're suddenly that person, and a lot of people didn't sign up for that. They signed up to be an investigator or sanctioned specialist, but with the rest of fin crime involved in it. Suddenly managing situations, managing political issues and managing staff with their personal issues becomes something they don't want to do.
Who's ultimately responsible for money laundering prevention? Is it actually the SMF 17 or is it the CEO of an organisation?
It's the CEO. So the MLRO is responsible for implementing the measures and identifying gaps, horizon scanning to make sure that you remain compliant, and making sure that the business you bring in is safe business, is good business. The CEO is the person who sets the tone for the organisation, sets out the fact that you are going to be a compliant organisation, that there will be no breaches tolerated. All policies will say that, but when you get into the nitty-gritty, how that's dealt with can be very different. No organisation will intentionally allow a breach of a regulation,
of course,
but some will play fast and loose with what they need to do. Some will sail right across the bottom line of regulation, and some will say we need to be up here. So we've got a buffer zone, so that if something goes wrong, we're not going to suddenly fall below the regulatory line. But there's costs involved, so the CEO has to balance that with all the businesses in his ear. Hopefully now, I think it's a lot more embedded in the business lines as well. And so most business people I know now are not trying to circumvent internal policy procedures, etc. But when I first started, it was open season. That was a regular thing. And I'm sure many other MLROs who've been in and around a while will say the same thing. But the CEO ultimately, and then the business heads, because their teams and they have to understand when they go out and meet new prospective clients that they're not just looking to bring on a new client for business, but they're looking to make sure that that client is the right type of client for the bank.
And I guess that then dictates as an MLRO where you want to work, because you've got to line up somewhere that has a similar culture to where you feel comfortable, but also a similar risk appetite to where you feel comfortable, and also a similar risk profile across the business where you feel comfortable or where it's appropriate. Or you're never going to go into an organisation and find that everything fits with your line of thinking. If you think you are, you're going to be disabused of that viewpoint very quickly. I always think as well, whenever an organisation tells me, oh, you're just coming in to take over from the last guy or the last lady and, run things, run a smooth ship. That's never true. Never true. If I've left somewhere and someone's gone in after me, and whether it's because of the person before not doing their role, or because the person before has left because they couldn't get the buy-in and the traction they needed to resolve some of the issues, which is quite a common thing as well. When I went into HVB, I maligned David Skade internally, not publicly, for not doing X, Y, and Z. But after 2-3 months of being there, I realised how much David had done to get the organisation to where it was, and that the reason, obviously he had other reasons for moving, as in he had a better position and what have you, but also he'd got to the point that he could go no further because he'd got as much traction and buy-in as he could get, and he'd done a really good job getting to that level. It's very easy to follow someone in and go, they didn't do this, they didn't do that. You don't know what they managed to achieve while they were there. What problems did they overcome? And that's the thing that I think you need to be very careful of. So final question for you and that, guys. We're often when firms come to us and say we need a new MLRO, someone's got to come in, they've got to be registered 17, they may or may not have had to have done it before, etc. Firms often say to us, but actually for the first 6, 9, 12 months, someone else internally is going to hold the tag so that we can get comfortable with them and they can get comfortable with us. Realistically, how long does it take you to go in somewhere and look in the cupboards and under the floorboards to know that you're comfortable taking on that 17?
Well, it can take years to get comfortable that you've looked under all the floorboards. The bigger the organisation, the longer that's going to take, or the more changes they've had, or the more new products they've built into their, suite of products that they have. Realistically, it takes 3 months, usually 3 to 4 months for the FCA to approve you. That should be enough time for you to get up to speed to be the MLRO. But the voyage of discovery doesn't stop there, because it's only then that when you've been in 3 months and you've met all the different business heads, you know a little bit more how they think and what they're like and how they play the game, if you like.
Yeah.
And then you start to see the holes or the gaps or the things that you need to fix. And you need to look at what the previous people have done and understand, as I say, how they got there, because there might be reasons why things are done a certain way. And again, I've fallen foul of this before. You know, I've gone in and I've had an idea of how you do something, and I've started to try and implement that quite quickly. And everyone's going, that will never work. No, this is the right way to do it. And then you realise why it doesn't work, whether it's a system within the bank that won't do certain things, or whether it's the flow that won't allow you to do it, or whatever it is.
Yeah.
But sometimes your grand plan or your grand ideas, and a lot of places now like a sort of, what will you do in the initial 3 months presentation from you before you go for the interview. That can only be based on what you think you're going to do.
Yeah.
And you have to put the caveats in that, you know, obviously I may come in, I may find this, I may find that, or I may find something different. So it takes, I would say it takes a year before you really understand the organisation.
Yeah.
And again, depending on how big that organisation is. And before you can really start to say, right, I understand exactly how everything flows in this bank now. I understand who I need to go to get those changes approved. Now I can start to make this change or that change.
Yeah. It's interesting you say that, because we often get asked for interview advice from people, right? And even silly things like I mentioned before, sleeves rolled up tattoo, should I wear a suit, should I wear this, that, the other, does it matter? And I say to everyone, be yourself, right? Like if you are that character, be that character, because you don't want to get a job and then it doesn't work and it doesn't fit when you get there. But the biggest one I'm reflective on is people say to us all the time, what would you do in the first 100 days and how do I answer that? And my personal opinion is that's one of the hardest questions to answer, because the response needs to be, I've got no idea, because until I get in and understand actually whether you're ahead of the curve or behind the curve on all the individual parts, how on earth can I comment on what happens next?
Yeah.
So the first 30 days I can talk quite openly on. I want to meet everyone. I want to spend time with people. I want to look around and I want to learn what you are, whether I've got the knowledge, the skill set or not. The next 70 days to get me to 100, I can't tell you what I'm going to change until I've had the chance to have a look about. But it feels like in financial crime that could be even longer than that, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think, 100 days is enough time to get a feel.
Yeah.
But you're not going to have met everyone 20 times in that. You're not going to have worked with everyone. So even though you may meet everyone, you're not going to have worked with them all.
Yeah.
So you might meet someone on week one. You don't interact with them again till 6 months later. You see them, in the canteen or at the water cooler or whatever, you say good morning. You might even be in a meeting with them, but you don't actually work with them until 6 months later.
Yeah.
And so you don't know how they work. And you might have, in that interim period, heard lots of rumours about X, Y, and Z. And of course, you've got to ignore all that and do it on your own basis. But it does take a long time to dig into the weeds. And I look at Commerzbank. When I was at Commerzbank, I was still finding things when I left 2.5 years after joining. And they weren't terrible things, but you were still finding things because it was in a system that no one had looked at for years or whatever.
Yeah.
And it came up because someone mentioned something and you thought that doesn't ring right.
Yeah.
But you wouldn't have known that in the first 100 days because that thought process wouldn't have made the tingle sense.
Yeah.
Or the senses tingle, I should say.
Yeah. No, that makes perfect sense. Peter, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure chatting. For anyone that's made it this far, listening to the pair of us, if you're interested, you called it IMLPO, I said IMLPO. If you're Googling IMLPO, go find out more, find out your learning, find out your development, sign up for a mentor scheme. There's plenty of opportunity there. Peter, thank you so much for your time.
Pleasure.